everybody. Welcome to episode 244 of the CRICKETher Weekly. And we are doing this a little bit differently this week because I am in Scotland doing some research on Scottish women's and girls cricket, which is quite exciting. How are you getting on down south, Sid?
We're all right. It's not snowing here. I believe it's been snowing in Scotland, and you went sledging, Raf. So you were
I
channeling your
did.
inner Alyssa Healy and went sledging.
I did go sledging, yes. Believe it or not, they actually don't get snow in Edinburgh particularly often. So it was quite exciting. And yes, there was lots of indignity with falling off sledges yesterday.
Okay.
And it took me a while, but I just got the Alyssa Healy joke. Very good, Sid. Well done.
Thanks.
Shall we talk about WBBL to start with? Because you've obviously been following everything while I've been up here beavering away sledging.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of the tournament basically, but we're recording just before the final game, and the final game does really matter because it's still possible that Heat could top the table, and it's still possible that the Sydney Sixers could sneak into the last four ahead of the Hobart Hurricanes. So the Sixers would need an absolutely huge win, so a doable win. They'd need to chase like 120 in like 8 overs or something. So just about conceivable. Yeah. So coming.
Now, Sid, just
Coming to the
on the
restructure.
on the Scotland thing, I have seen James Bryce a couple of times, and there's obviously a Bryce off going on potentially in WBBL because Sarah's team, the Sixers, could edge out Catherine's team, the Hurricanes. So that was a little bit of chat yesterday about that.
Yeah, there'll only be one Bryce in the final stages. That's true. And yeah, Hurricanes Bryce. I'm gonna not gonna lie, Raf. I can't remember which one's playing for which team.
Catherine is playing for the Hurricanes, Sid.
Okay, so Catherine actually, got them over the line yesterday. I really
Yeah.
thought the Hurricanes were finished yesterday, and Julia Price on comms was going, "Oh, they're not finished. They can still do this." And I was like, "Julia, you're just this is just your former Hurricanes coach inner Hurricanes coach talking here." But she was right. They came through it, at the end. Anyway, still all to play for there. It's been a bit of a strange season, really, in a sense, because it's we have this shortened tournament. I'm not completely convinced that the positions that we've ended up with really reflect where the teams are. Let's look at the strikers, for example. The strikers were the first team to be eliminated, and yet ultimately they've ended up only 3 points off qualification. So just 3 points short of qualification, but they got eliminated. It feels like weeks ago. Um, you know, so what we've lost with that longer tournament is the opportunity for kind of teams to kind of rebuild narratives. There was no opportunity for the strikers to have. If they'd had another 4 games, they could well have come back and then gone on to win the tournament. So it just feels a bit of a pity. That's the thing that we've lost there. And Renegades at the top of the table. They've got the highest net run rate by a long way. Do they look especially convincing at this stage? Mm, you
But
know,
Sid, you must be really excited because Grace Scrivens has got her opportunity.
She has got a little bit of an opportunity. She had 2 games in theory, but she's only played one of them. She was carded to bat at 8 and wasn't needed. So, and I suspect the same thing will happen. I mean, the likelihood is that Renegades will be the ones that qualify directly for the final. So they've only got 1 game left. She'll probably be carded down the order. She'll probably only get a bat if they're in trouble. And if they're in trouble, well, they're probably in trouble. So not the easiest opportunity for her to take, but on the other hand, you take them, and it's her first opportunity to play in an international franchise tournament. And if she gets a bat, hopefully she gets the chance to show a little bit of what she can do. But again, it's if she gets a bat, it's because they're already in trouble, and you're expecting a lot of her to ask her to rescue it for someone that's not
Yeah.
like an explosive, big hitting player.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's where we are at with WBBL. We'll be looking forward to the finals and things next week. The other big development in Australia, which is relevant to talking about WBBL, is that Georgia Voll has been called up to the Australian side. So Alyssa Healy, as we mentioned last week, still not available for the upcoming ODIs against India. So Georgia Voll's going to get her opportunity. She's going to get probably 3 games, maybe 6 games, because she'll possibly get to play some games in New Zealand as well. It's quite a short opportunity though, and it's like one of those interesting things. Like she knows that she's going to lose her place again when Alyssa Healy comes back. How much of does that take the pressure off? Does it put more pressure on you knowing that you've only got those 6 games? She's still young. I think she's a really interesting kind of player. She's been playing since 2020 at the top level. So she made WNCL debut at the beginning of 2020, WBBL debut at the end of 2020. Something very interesting she's got in common with Courtney Winfield Hill, Raf. What do you think she might have in common with Courtney Winfield Hill? Raf looks puzzled.
They've been teachers? I don't know.
No, she's a bit young to have taught anybody, and she's only 21. They're both former rugby league players. So
Aha.
Georgia Voll played junior rugby league, or NRL as it's known in Australia, because they're both from Queensland, which is the sort of the NRL capital of Australia, I believe. Hope I've got that right. Yeah, so and she's had a really good WBBL. She's made 2 scores in the 90s. She's also had a score in the 90s in WNCL this year, but in previous years she's also made 200s in WNCL. That's in the 50 over competition. And in terms of a batter, very much a sort of direct replacement for Alyssa Healy, someone that will relish batting in the power play, will be quite aggressive, hits over the top, plays a lot in front of the wicket. Kind of, it's going to be really interesting to see her paired up with Phoebe Litchfield, because of course Phoebe Litchfield's known for playing all around the shop. So and whereas Georgia Voll, more like Alyssa Healy, is going to look to go over the ring in the V and things. She'll play aggressively. She is the kind of player where she'll either hit a big score or she'll get out quite quickly. That tends to be her kind of modus operandi. But I'll be really interested to see how she goes.
Absolutely. Great opportunity for her.
Yeah.
A little bit closer to home, Sid, there's been some big announcements about what our domestic season in England is going to look like in 2025. Now, obviously, we already knew that there was going to be a women's Vitality Blast and a women's One Day Cup, mirroring what's happening in the men's game. And there's also going to be this new women's county kind of FA Cup type competition. So we've got most of the fixtures now. Lots of double headers happening in the Blast as we expected, although there are some single header games as well. And actually, an interesting conversation on the Naughty Child podcast this week about Knott's approach to fixtures in particular.
Yeah, so I mean, worth having a listen to North Child podcast. There's a couple of points that they bring up. The first is about the Knots situation, or the Blaze situation, because of course they're not Knots, they are still the Blaze, and they're playing 2 big fixtures at the grounds of other counties, including one in Derbyshire, who are kind of the great local rivals. And Polly has a bit of a rant about this on the Naughty Child, very much seeing this as sort of almost a betrayal of the kind of the ethos of it being county cricket and the county being the thing that matters, as the Blaze look like they're trying to maintain more of a regional identity. How do you feel about that, Raf? Do you think that do you think Polly's right that they should be going for a pure county identity and shouldn't be playing at Derbyshire and things?
I don't really have an issue with it, to be honest.
Okay.
I'm a little bit surprised, I think, because my feeling was that the teams who'd missed out on being in tier one would actually be a bit too disappointed to then let their neighbouring county, who had got the tier one bid and been successful in that, to actually let them come and play at your ground seems a little bit of a surprising move. But if you can fix it up, then why not? I mean, we know that Hampshire are going to be playing at least one game at Arundel, right, which is in Sussex, although not owned by Sussex, so it's slightly different. The other thing is, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, that I got the chance to interview Beth Barrett-Wild this week, and she talked about the fact that they are hoping that, or the plan is for the kind of the talent pathway catchment areas to remain regional. And so there's going to be 10 of those, and that will mean that actually there will be an element of counties continuing to work together within regions to develop talent. And she said that was really important to avoid a kind of postcode lottery approach, where if you're a girl in Hampshire, you've got great opportunities. If you're a girl in Sussex, you've only got tier two opportunities. So I think that the ECB recognised that there were some real strengths to the regional structure that they're trying to carry over a little bit more. And again, based on conversations we've had over the last few weeks, we believe that, for example, the Vipers Academy is going to stay the Vipers. So there will be an element of that name carrying over as well, even if Hampshire haven't gone with being the Hampshire Vipers. So I've gone a little bit away from the kind of knots issue, but I think that it's all tied in with this thing of actually it's okay to carry over some of the good points and the strengths of the regional structure, which was counties working together to do the best thing for women's cricket. And if you're local to the Derbyshire County Cricket Ground, and that means that you can get along and watch a higher standard of local domestic women's cricket, then that seems like a good thing to me.
Okay. There was one other point that Richard made as well about the double headers, which is the enormous amount of pressure that's going to be put on some of the tier two players.
Mm.
Because this is really interesting that we assumed that the double headers would mostly be restricted to the tier one sides. But in fact, there's loads of tier two double headers. So you've got like teams like Middlesex, who are going to be essentially an amateur team playing in tier two, participating in a double header at Lords. And that's a lot of pressure. To put on what are essentially going to be young amateur players. Any thoughts on that one, Raf?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's a fair point actually. And I think it will be interesting to see, for example, which of those matches are on TV, and which aren't, I suppose. Which again is something that Sky will presumably be figuring out a little bit closer to the time. So yeah, I think Richard's got a good point there. I suppose the idea is that tier two is, you've just described it as amateur, but the ECB are trying to put some provisions in place so that it looks a little bit more like a semi-professional setup. And again, there was a little bit more information forthcoming from Beth Barrett-Wild this week about what that's going to look like in terms of the minimum requirements. So there's going to be some minimum staffing requirements. They're going to have each tier two county will have to have 2 full-time staff to run the women's program. Now, that
Okay.
might not sound very much compared with what's happening in tier one, but it's still a lot more than any of the counties ever had before, barring Surrey, who are a little bit ahead of the 8 ball there. Um, yeah, so it's an interesting one, but she did also admit that when there'd been this whole consultation process with Tier 2, Beth Barrett-Wild actually said, I was quite struck, not in a good way, about the age demographic of players. They were talking about playing in their women's team. This is senior cricket, and we need more women playing. And so there'd apparently been a little bit of disquiet amongst tier two, basically people going, well, if we're playing a lot of games in May, then all of our players are like under 18 and they're all going to be doing school exams, and that's not great. And Beth's kind of looking at that and going, well, hang on a minute, shouldn't you be having some people who are aged over 18 in your adult women's tier two team? So there's definitely a recognition there, actually, a kind of tacit recognition that we've got a problem with player depth, and the player pool and the lack of and some of those tier two counties are going to maybe struggle to turn out high quality teams, because even though the staffing structure there's minimum requirements, the players are still essentially going to be amateurs because they won't be contracted.
Mhm.
So it was quite revealing, some of what Beth said actually. But yeah, I tend to agree with Richard that I think that particularly if those games are on TV, it could be quite tricky.
Okay.
What do you think, Sid? Do you agree?
Yeah, I am inclined to agree. I worry that people are going to, put a lot of pressure on the players. If there's a load of fans in, if you've got 10,000 fans coming to a men's blast game and a couple of thousand of them are in early to see the women's game, that's actually still quite a lot of people putting pressure on you, potentially shouting at you, watching it. You're fielding for every mistake. Fielding mistakes feel like they really get amplified in those kind of situations, and that's the kind of place where you're really under the point where you're really under pressure. And if the fielding is the big thing, that if you're an amateur, you haven't had that much time to practice, right? All the focus will be on your key skill. And the fielding,
Yeah.
one thing we saw massively improve when people became professional, 5 years ago. And I worry for what it's going to potentially do to those people and to the fans' reaction to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, shall I talk a little bit more about the Beth Barrett Wild interview?
Yeah, it was a long conversation. I was kind of listening to you in the background. Obviously, you were on headphones. I could hear you talking, and it went on for nearly an hour, didn't it? So much stuff.
Yes, it did go on for nearly an hour, and there was a lot of very granular detail, and some of the kind of nerdier elements I wasn't able to talk about in my Guardian piece. I think for me, the most important thing that she said was what I led with in the Guardian piece, which was actually it's about the monitoring of how the counties are going to spend the money. And actually, from what she said, the expectations on those 8/10 tier one counties are going to be extremely high in terms of gender equality. So she's actually saying that we expect them to have exactly the same standards for their women's team as their men's team. So the grounds have to fulfill the same requirements. The marketing has to be the same. So you're kind of going, okay, so the Surrey Twitter account has to put out the same number of tweets about the women's team as it does the men's, because that doesn't seem to be what's happening at the moment, but it's very interesting. So yeah, actually hearing about this new county partnership agreement that's kicking in February was actually quite reassuring, because we've talked quite a bit about fears that the counties would somehow creatively find a way to filter some of this money they're getting from the ECB into actually just bolstering the salaries of their men's players. And from what Beth said, that's just not going to be possible. She actually said, I'm going to know how every pound is being spent. So it's that level of ability of the ECB to see what's going on. I suppose the only question mark then is, because she did say we have the ability to suspend funding or withdraw funding if they're getting it wrong. The question is whether they would actually ever see that through, and whether in practice that would ever happen. But it's quite a big threat to be able to hold over the counties, and a really
Yeah.
important one, I think, because where we want to get to is a place where they don't have to have that threat, where there has been genuine cultural change within the counties, so they are all embracing women's cricket. But I don't believe we're there yet. And I think that what we saw in the Independent Commission for Equity report a year and a half ago was actually there's a lot of detail about what was going on at the counties and the kind of people who were working at the counties, and some of it was very unpleasant reading from a perspective of kind of sexism and misogyny. And until we've got that generational change, then the ECB do need to be monitoring it, and they do need to be checking that things are going okay. The other thing was obviously this survey that they're introducing for all of the women's staff and players. And so it is literally designed to encourage whistleblowing, to encourage people to say to anonymously, things aren't going very well at our county. This happened the other day and you need to sort it out. So hopefully there are going to be enough safeguards in place that things go well with the new setup, because Beth was pretty firm that this is the last change that they're going to make, and it needs to work essentially.
Yeah,
She
the social media thing, if I can just interrupt briefly, was
Yeah.
really interesting. I actually looked at the side of the social media on, I ventured back onto Twitter. I'm usually a blue sky guy these days. Ventured back onto Twitter and looked at some of the social media coming out of the counties, and the announcement about the fixtures. They definitely were still making a lot more fuss. They were basically focusing on the men and going, "Come and watch the men in the Vitality Blast,
Mm.
and watch your favourite men's players play in the men's." Okay, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the focus of that social media was very much on the men's team. It definitely wasn't 50-50.
Mm.
So it'll be interesting to see, is that how it's going to go on, or are they actually going to, are the social media people going to get, potentially, I would guess that Beth might be calling them all into a meeting collectively and going, you need to change your approach to this because, we've looked at your blast announcements and they weren't, equal. They just weren't.
Yeah.
So yeah. So what else did she have to say apart from the stuff about this, Raf? Give us some more of the
The
gossip.
nerdy detail. Yeah.
Yeah.
So she was asked whether there is likely to be a Red Bull element to tier one. And she said not in this cycle, basically. And by this cycle, we mean kind of running up to the end of 2028.
29. Okay.
Um, so she says, given the volume of Test cricket for women, I don't believe it's at a critical mass that we need to have a full-on competition. There are other ways we can provide exposure opportunities for our domestic players to Red Bull without having a full competition. So what she's
Okay, but
kind
there
of
are other ways. That's interesting in itself, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
it's just there might be something going on. Maybe another one of these north-south games that they
Yes.
tried to do a couple of years
Yeah.
ago.
I think that might be what she was hinting at. And I think also if the counties wanted to organise some Red Bull stuff amongst themselves, then the ECB aren't going to stop them. But that's quite different in terms of sort of volume to actually going, okay, well, we've got three tier one, two, and three competitions running, and now we're going to try and also insert a Red Bull one.
Although, they do that with the men.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying I agree with her, but she's basically saying that she's ruled out that happening for the next 4 years. So that was interesting. Um, there was also a conversation about overseas players because in the regional system, teams have only been able to field one overseas player. And that's actually going to continue over into the county era. So it's going to remain at one overseas player, um, at least for the next season. It might change after that. And Beth actually said that she wanted it to be opened up to two. Um, but they have this thing called the Cricket Advisory Group, which has got various people on it, including people like Laura McLeod and Danny Warren from within our side of the game, who actually said no, we think it should stay at one. And the reason for that is we feel that the money should be going at this point on developing more English domestic players rather than all of the costs of trying to fly in a second overseas player. So it's fair enough, I think. So that's staying the same. That's a bit of information that was completely new to me. Um, I've talked about the requirements for tier two, but just to wrap up, there was another interesting thing that she talked about, whereby there's going to be an official player movement framework in place to regulate players moving between the tiers. So it means that it should be relatively straightforward for somebody to move from tier three into tier two, or from tier one potentially and then into tier two. If somebody's a kind of fringe tier one player, they're not getting a lot of cricket, they should be able to go and play tier two cricket fairly straightforwardly. It's going to be slightly more complicated if you're in tier three or more likely tier two and you're trying to move up into tier one, because you're not just going to be able to play the odd game here and there. You're going to actually have to have a contract in place to do that. Because everybody that's playing in tier one has to have a contract because it's professional. So that's how the ECB are doing it. But it's going to be regulated, but it is going to be relatively fluid as well. So I think that's really good because that means if you do get somebody in tier two who's suddenly having a bit of a breakout season, then there's going to be potential for them to kind of shifty up and get access to a higher quality, a higher standard of cricket.
Yeah, and also if you've got someone in tier one that's on the fringe of the side and is playing 12th man, the whole time,
Yeah.
we don't wind up with someone in tier one that's like, just almost good enough to be in the team, but then has to spend an entire season and gets no cricket whatsoever. They sort of turn into Freya Kemp, if you like, spending all the time sitting on the sidelines running drinks
Yeah.
rather than actually playing something. So it's really important that those people will be able to kind of shift down to tier two and actually, get some games under their belt rather than always being the kind of 12th.
Yeah. Yeah, so overall it was really good to talk to Beth. I always come away from our conversations feeling like she knows what she's doing. Even if there are the odd detail here and there to still iron out, she's working on it, and it's falling into place. And I feel a lot more confident about the new structure, or I felt a lot more confident about the new structure after I spoke to her than before, which is obviously the way it should be, ideally.
So Beth Barrett-Wild pulls it off again, you think?
I think so. I mean, I think we're going to have to see what happens next season. The proof's going to be in the pudding a little bit. And she did actually say that it's going to take a little bit of time for everything to bed down and it's not going to be perfect immediately. But she believes that the direction of travel is right. And it does seem that she is correct in that from everything that I can see at the moment.
Okay.
Now, finally, Sid, we can't conclude today's episode without mentioning the fact that there's actually going to be uh, an England series starting later today. So England now out in South Africa, and the multi-format series is getting underway today with the first of three T20s in East London, I
Yeah,
believe.
that's not in Mile End, Raf. That's that's East London in South Africa.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. So a T20 being played later today. So interesting to see how England get on after their last match that they played, which is obviously the one against West Indies. Interesting to see how South Africa get on. Perhaps more interestingly, having just lost a World Cup final, although unlike England, they actually got to the final. And Heather Knight has been on the press circuit. Did a press conference yesterday in which the main takeaway line seems to be, "It's important we don't rip up trees." So Heather Knight, the environmentalist, said, "Who knew?"
Yeah, budding Greta Thunberg. Um,
I don't I didn't really quite follow that
no, I'm not
line.
entirely sure what ripping up trees actually means. You'd have thought ripping up trees, it feels like it would be like an assertive thing, a positive thing, although obviously nobody wants to rip up trees because of the environment. But yeah, I'm
Yeah, but you
confused by
have
it.
to make bats, Sid.
Yeah, it was very much a press conference that when, we're terribly humble, but we're still one of the best sides in the world, and we're a top side, and we're extremely fit, and we're an extremely brilliant, wonderful side, but we're very humble. Um,
Yes.
so, well,
Yes.
let's see how all this goes. South Africa obviously without Marizanne Kapp, who is resting while still apparently playing WBBL. So
Which is
go
very
figure.
restful.
Um, so that does hand England a bit of an advantage. Definitely. Well, one of South Africa's two best players, if not their best one, with Laura Wolf, obviously arguably the best one. Um, yeah, it's going to be a big challenge for England this series, I think. And let's see how South Africa, whether they can kind of assert themselves and kind of really say, that World Cup final wasn't a fluke. That's going to be the really interesting thing for me. Because can South Africa take this World Cup final, or the two World Cup finals they've now appeared in the space of a couple of years, and go, look, this isn't a fluke. We're now a top side, and we're going to start playing that across the board rather than
Yeah.
just playing well in World Cups and then coming up against England and collapsing in a heap 7 times. So
Yeah, and I have to say there is quite a big bit of me that actually doesn't want England to now go on and have a really successful series, and that feels like a terrible thing to admit. But actually, I feel that they haven't learned any lessons from the World Cup, and that and an actually genuinely humbling experience would be to lose this series against South Africa, and then they might feel that they've got no choice but to accept that something's going wrong. At the moment, it feels like they're trying to just put the West Indies match firmly behind them, um, but not in a kind of productive way, in a kind of let's pretend it never happened type
yeah,
way. And that's really not a good place for them to be. And so I don't like to say it, but I think that they need something, they need another catalyst. And so I would really like to see South Africa do really well in this series, because I think that what Heather Knight showed in that press conference yesterday is that they haven't, as we talked about last week, they haven't learned any lessons. She is still in denial about many of the things that are so apparent. Oh, I don't think the team's lost without me. There's a huge amount of leaders in the group. Both of those are direct quotes from things she said. And you just go, but did you watch that match against the West Indies? It's like they're in a kind of different plane of existence to us sometimes. So very odd. And yeah, as I say, don't like to not want England to do well, but think that they could do with yet another wake up call, to be honest.
yeah, because they haven't woken up from the one they've had. They've
No.
slept through the alarm, and the
Yeah. Sid looks for ways to extend his metaphor.
yeah, they've slept through the alarm. They've slept through breakfast. It's 11 a.m. and they're staggering down to the restaurant in the hotel, going, "Where's our cornflakes?" And the hotel, are now only, you know, serving lunch.
Sid, I think I'm going to wrap up this episode before your metaphor completely
Keels
curls
over
up
and
and
dies.
dies. Exactly. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we will see you in a week's time. Bye for now.
Bye.